Well, thanks for having me. This is my first access. Obviously, this is a coveted conference to come to, and I had to pin my star to John to get here. It's cool to be in a room with so many people who have muted me on Twitter, so hello to you all. I'd like to give a shout out to the folks watching on the live stream. I think we have some people back home watching. No pressure, John. I did take that curse word out of the slide at the last minute, though, so. I really want to begin this presentation by acknowledging that we originally pitched this with a third person who was our colleague Bridget Whittle, who did at least as much work on this as both of us combined and probably more. She was at least as instrumental as us in bringing this to fruition. She couldn't be here today, so I really want to acknowledge her contributions to this project. Without her, we wouldn't have AtoM at all, so shouts to Bridget, and sorry you couldn't be here. All right, let's jump in. So before I get into my content, I want to ask how many archivists do I have in the room here? Ooh, tough crowd. Roger's the only one, okay. All right, thanks, Roger, for being here, the one archivist in the room. And how many of you, if you know, are using access to memory in your own shop in your special collections department? Okay, so a few hands. That's awesome, good. I think this is increasingly becoming an industry standard, so we're going to take you through where we started when we moved to AtoM and where we ended up and where we may end up going. So the first slide is called The Horror, and that's for a very good reason. When we came to this project, our archival descriptions were totally unstructured HTML web pages, 893 of them. No one had ever put the field headings of the rules for archival description, which is the descriptive standard we use in Canada. No one had put field headings into any of the descriptions, which meant that scripting anything for that was impossible because a line break might skip 3 or 4 fields and there was no way to point anything at it that could automate a data transfer. So because we had no field delineation, that meant that basically migrating to AtoM involved making our student workers copy and paste 893 archival descriptions into a new piece of software. Really sorry, you guys. I apologize. One of them has since decided to go into librarianship, so apparently this was not a sufficient deterrent, although we really tried to make it a sufficient deterrent. So we couldn't crawl it, we couldn't automate and export, and I have many hands make blight work. These are descriptions that have been worked on by dozens of people over a period of about 40 years. So we have a lot of inconsistencies in descriptive practice over that time. So even if we had been able to automate it, it wouldn't have worked. So we had to do it all by hand, which was kind of an interesting and new experience. So those of you who are familiar with AtoM, which may not be a whole ton of you beyond knowing that it works in your institution, AtoM is built around archival descriptive standards, and it really hangs on 2 standards. It hangs on ISAT-G, which is the international standard that Canada would use if we had a brain, and it hangs on the rules for archival description, which is our homemade, the less said about it, the better, archival descriptive standard that is, thank God, now finally being revised. Rules for archival description has a just reputation for being precious, finicky, and easy to get wrong. We also have a lot of manuscripts that for various reasons are described as part of our archival holdings rather than as books. Because as you know, manuscripts, right, they're not quite bibliographic. They're handwritten, they're between an archival document and an authorized form of a book. So in our institution, all the manuscripts are described as archival holdings, essentially. We also have some inorganic collections. Now this is archivist speak for things that don't flow organically from a single creator. So somebody has gone out, say, and they've collected a ton of material relating to the First World War just for the sake of collecting it. I'm going to get my hands on every piece of correspondence from the First World War ever. That's interesting, but it's also a bit piecemeal, right? Whereas an archivist would usually seek out a soldier's archive. So you've got his journals, his correspondence. It tells a person's story or an entity's story. Inorganic collections means there is no creator that can readily be identified other than the person that collected the stuff. And we also had what I've euphemistically called descriptive idiosyncrasies. As I'm sure you all know, the ways that we refer to cultural phenomena have shifted dramatically in the last 100 years. So we had some legacy descriptions that we later discovered had language that necessarily was horrific and we would not use today. I want to talk specifically about how we staffed this project, because this was a kind of a weird thing. And this was my first, I was the project manager for this, and this was the first thing I did when I got to McMaster. The first project I ever managed, so if anything went wrong with it, it's totally my fault. No one reports to me. I am a peon at the lowest possible level of my union and my organization. None of the people who worked on this team could be compelled to do anything by me. I had no leverage over any of them. In fact, everybody on the team reported to a different supervisor, so I could only hope to play them off against one another and hope that nobody really noticed what was going on. So we had a team of, really a core team of 4 people working on the project. So we had John on the back end. We had our designer, Debbie, working on the CSS. I was managing the project, and Bridget was the person who was responsible for actually figuring out how to do a lot of the migration, and she supervised the student workers who actually had the thankless task of copying and pasting all this stuff. So we have a lot of moving pieces, and we have student workers who are not familiar with our descriptive standard, so we had to give them a crash course in understanding an extremely finicky and arcane standard such that they could parse these non-delineated HTML pages and correctly input the data into the correct fields of AtoM. So as you're probably intuiting, this is a 2-in-1 project. It's a software implementation, but it's also a structured data project. So getting stuff into AtoM was way harder than getting it out will be. So that's kind of the long-term value add here. And now I'm going to get John to talk about the back end a little bit.
Okay, I apologize. Oh, sorry. Oh, my God. First off, I'm going to apologize for, if anyone's ever seen me talk before, I usually like to pace around and everything, but my understanding is if I pace around, maybe you can't hear me, and maybe the camera can't hear me, so I'm going to try very hard to stay rigid at this podium and not walk around like a caged lion. I also apologize for the slide. I have no art in my soul whatsoever, and so all my slides with any kind of thing that is not text are all this kind of very sparse, ugly thing. So anyway, the back end, when we started putting it together, first I want to give a shout out to the Artifactual folks because their documentation for installing is very, very, very good. It's very clear, it's very clean. If you follow it and you're using the recommended components, which there's no reason to deviate from, it's actually quite a simple install. That said, of course I wanted to make it more complicated. There's not, I forgot to include it in this, but a critical piece of this is our Docker infrastructure, which I'm very glad the IT folks at UNB talked about it yesterday, so I don't have to do that much introduction into what containerization is and what Docker is. But if you look at this graph, Apache on the top there sits on a machine that is publicly accessible, and then everything underneath it is a Docker container. Nginx is, Elasticsearch, and MariaDB is. Now, I don't remember, Myron, if you're talking about our problems with versioning later. I think you are. Okay, so I'll leave that fun for Myron to talk about. But briefly, we're stuck on old versions of both AtoM and also Elasticsearch. These work in tandem really well most of the time, but as we have discovered over the past couple days, whenever Myron and I are not on site, either smells happen or water and floods happen, or in my case, a server ran out of disk space and Elasticsearch decided to be unhappy about it and stop indexing. But it's very, very simple otherwise. They recommend MySQL. You can drop in MariaDB, and I advise you do so if you can. They work in tandem. They talk really well. It's mostly a brainless and very nice install as long as you don't run out of disk space or touch it in any way. I put this slide in with a question mark because I don't know CSS and JS. To my knowledge, Debbie, who is our developer, themed it quite nicely using a nice sort of module plugin for Elasticsearch and developed a sort of thematic branding, which I later stuck in to make it look nice and McMastery, which I am expecting contains CSS and JS, but now that I say it, I'm not 100% sure that's all it was. Another issue, though, related also to our versioning is that we occasionally, and I'm not 100% clear on this, so I may have to bring you into this. Yep. We had problems with database corruption at the very beginning related around Duplicate records, was that in?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so our programmer who, again, is wonderful, a wonderful, wonderful programmer who did the CSS and JS and also gave me a SQL total, you know, I am very bad at SQL stuff, gave me a nice script to dedupe and sort of reharmonize the SQL stuff. And that was nice, but that's another thing that we had to kind of watch out for in doing development, are these kind of broken records, if you will, duplicate records that really cause the database munging. So really the critical issue is pay attention and love your programmers and do multiple backups. Nope.
All right, so I'm going to speak to some of those idiosyncrasies that we ran into along the way with versioning in SQL. We'll speak to the SQL piece first because it kind of took us by surprise. This was really during the final stages of the project as we were launching it. I'm going to try and describe this bug very rapidly. Basically, a major component of our AtoM install, and one of the things that we wanted to do to add value to the collections, was to develop a controlled vocabulary of natural language subject headings that correspond to our major collecting areas as an institution, right? So the things that researchers are coming to us for, we wanted them to be able to drill down and say, okay, so you collect in the First World War, great, what else do you have in that area? And if it's First World War, that's good, but is it also local history related? Is there a Hamilton connection? So we actually built a controlled vocabulary for this, which is probably the thing that we've gotten the best feedback on. Now the trouble is, all data input in AtoM is done through a web-based application, right? So you've got a UI that has fields that you pull up, you put data into, and you're good to go. The subject headings are something where you've developed a controlled vocabulary, so it's basically a drop-down menu, right? You click on a drop-down, you get a list of the available subjects, you click the one you want, and then something terrible happens. Because the drop-down will remain open and highlight the subject heading that you've just put on, and if you inadvertently hit enter at that stage, a bug will create a duplicate subject heading with the exact same name that has a URL that a user can be directed to that will appear in your taxonomy that is totally dead and cannot be deleted in any way through the UI. So the only way to get rid of it is to do some pretty gnarly SQL surgery and excise a value from I think 6 or 7 different tables. Yeah. So if we hadn't had an SQL wizard on this, our whole install would have been borked horrifically badly, like right before launch. So thanks, Debbie. You saved our bacon on that one. It's a known bug, and I don't know if we've mentioned yet, but we should. Artifactual is a fantastic company. AtoM's a fantastic product. It's an open source product. The documentation around it is very good. The user community is very good. But obviously not all bugs can be addressed with extreme alacrity because funding drives a lot of the development of the software. So this is a known bug, but it's something that nobody has paid to fix yet. A lot of people aren't making as heavy use of the subject headings as we are. So I brought it up, and it was like, yeah, that's totally a known bug. It's something we want to fix, but it'll be in a future development cycle, and you're kind of on your own for now. So fortunately, we were able to figure that out. And we also have a really interesting thing going on with version control that I want to bring up for anyone who's considering implementing this. Our descriptions make relatively heavy use of rich text. Italics and bold especially, also quite a few HTML links, but a lot of rich text because we'll be referring to published materials in italics and using kind of a standard way of expressing those things. And in our community, we're all familiar with italicization for titles and whatnot. So we have a lot of those in our archival descriptions. A version update occurred while we were implementing the software that escaped HTML tagging within descriptive fields. All of our rich text was done through pre-HTML5 tags. And we found this out when we spun up a sandbox for the next version just to make sure that it worked and it was compatible with our stuff. And I looked at the descriptions, I'm like, oh my God, it's barfed HTML tags into all of the descriptions and the rich text is gone. What did I do wrong? Did I break my database? And then I read the fine print of the release notes and realized that they had escaped that functionality. And I was like, oh my God, it's way too late now to make the students, or myself, more likely is going to be the person who eventually deals with this, crawl through 893 descriptions and delete every tag. Now there is a script that allegedly does this, but it only really plays well with HTML5 tags. So it struggles with BNI a little bit. So we would basically need to manually delete hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tags from our descriptions, which we really don't want to do. Unfortunately, that means we're stuck on an old version. I want to say indefinitely, but it's not indefinitely, because I actually managed to get, and again, the artifactual community are fantastic. I managed to get I managed to corner the CEO of Artifactual at a conference last week and say, hey, is this, what's the inside track on this? Is this going to be, are we ever going to see rich text functionality again? And very diplomatically it was like, I don't think that you should necessarily bank on that happening in any kind of like a soonish time frame. So maybe that might be a functionality that you might want to consider taking out of your own records. So at some point I'm actually going to have to go and clean all that up, which is going to be kind of crappy, because there's a very major version upgrade in the pipeline to 3.0. I have been assured that we will have a clean upgrade path from any trunk on the 2.x line, but we're going to have the ongoing problem with rich text. So we're going to have to clean all that out, which is not going to be fun to sell back home. And I'm glad that the director of my department is actually on vacation right now, because I haven't told him yet, and I know he's not watching this live stream, so sorry in absentia, Rick. Yeah. So this is really, I like to say muplup, more product, less process, or whatever, I forget which one it is. I think it's product. One of the things that my shop prides itself on is that we have very little descriptive backlog, right? I think the oldest thing in our backlog is from 2008. If we accept archival material, we make it accessible as quickly as possible to people. We don't want it moldering, okay? That means that we process things quite rapidly, and there has been some streamlining in our approach to the descriptive standard that means that we were able to give the students a basic crash course in the descriptive standard, but they didn't get everything. So they would occasionally be taking a value and plugging it into the wrong field, which we didn't realize until a little bit later on when we were doing data cleanup about a month or so before launch. And so what I would be seeing is when I went to go publish records, AtoM very helpfully gives you an error message that says this is not a Rad compliant description. Now, fortunately, you can actually push through that and publish a non-compliant description, so we just decided to do that in the end and clean them up gradually as we go along. Our users can understand the records, and it was more important for us to push it out. But it means that some mandatory fields are not populated in all descriptions. There was some ambiguity about what constituted a scope and content note versus an arrangement note and that sort of thing. This is archival arcana, but it's pretty important for standards compliance. It means that some of the mandatory fields are not populated, so technically a lot of our records are ill-formed, but whatever. Now, how do we solve some of these weird problems? We've chosen to treat Rad Compliance as a serving suggestion. You know the serving suggestion, like you get a cereal box or the cereal ad and it shows the bowl of like chocolate frosted sugar bombs, but there's also like bananas and healthy fruit and stuff. And you know the kids are really just eating the cereal, but technically they're supposed to be eating all the other nutritious stuff on the side. So this is kind of that kind of model where really we're having a pretty stripped down approach to what constitutes Rad compliance. We actually think this is, we're praying that this will work to our benefit as Rad is under revision right now, and we may get to a point where some of the things that we've been lazy about are clamored for by the community so much that we'll end up being ahead of the curve by being behind the curve, which is going to be great. Getting the manuscript holdings into AtoM was a little bit of an intellectual challenge because they're not really aggregations of material in the way that most archives are. And in many cases, a manuscript of sufficient age, you can't clearly link to an authority record because you might not know the scribe's name, you might not know who wrote it. So if I have a Boethius Constellations of Philosophy manuscript from 1150, who's the author of the work? Is it the scribe? Is it Boethius? Is it a true copy of Boethius' original? Can I trace where error is entered into it? No. So I can't have a one-to-one authority record for that manuscript. Or if I did, I would be grossly underrepresenting or misrepresenting the text. And so what we did is we just took the approach of having no authority records attached to manuscripts, and any information about the scribe is in the description itself. And our users have actually said that that works really well for them, and that they appreciate that we're not misrepresenting the scribal history of a text. We had the same problem with the kind of organic collections thing, or the inorganic collections thing. Who's the creator of an inorganic collection? It's the person who collected the stuff. Where we have chosen to append an authority record to an inorganic collection, we make it very clear that this individual collected the material and was not the author or creator of it in an archival sense. This sounds like meaningless pedantry to a lot of librarians, but for archivists, this is very hardcore and important stuff to consider. With some of our descriptive weirdnesses, we kind of just had to make a value judgment. If we saw an error in the way we had done descriptive practice that was sufficiently widespread, we had to just make an affordance for that. Particularly, as I said before, disambiguating between scope and content and arrangement notes was quite challenging. Scope and content tells you at a very zoomed out level what is in an archive, and arrangement tells you about how it appears, what series are there, what further subdivisions of the materials are there. And because of the way we've done description, you can't always ambiguate between those two things very well. And so that goes back to the kind of mandatory fields piece. And one of the projects that I've been trying to advance since we've had our implementation, does anyone know their Bible really well? I know one or two of you do, but you're not going to raise your hands. Judges 14:14 is the Samson's riddle, which isn't really a riddle. It's just like a sadistic device that he does because he wants to torture some Philistines. It's really messed up. Basically, Samson is messing with some Philistines, and he's like, yo, I'm going to ask you a riddle. And they're like, yeah, whatever, we're smart. And he goes, where can you get sweetness out of the strong? And they're like, what the hell are you talking about? And of course, this is like the Gollum Lord of the Rings riddle, where it's not actually a riddle, it's just something that Gollum saw that Bilbo can't know about. So what happened is that Samson saw a decaying lion's corpse that bees had built a hive in, and there was honey in there. And he's like, yeah, check it out of the strong sweetness. And the Philistines are like, we could never know that. And he's like, I'm going to kill you anyway. So one of the things that we got out of this, the sweetness out of the strong, was that in the process of migration, we actually had a chance to look at each of our 893 descriptive records. And so this also became a redescription project in a certain way. And in one very limited instance, what I did is crawl every single description for what we might euphemistically call 20th century language around the indigenous peoples of Canada, and tried to replace inappropriate references with demonyms that do credit to the actual peoples who are being referred to. And so this really gave us a chance to zoom out on stuff. And those of you who are familiar with archives know that there's usually a lot of emphasis on description, but not a lot of emphasis on redescription, right? Very few archives have a very established process of saying, you know what, every 20 years we'll revisit each description to see if it's still above board, if it's still appropriate. And this actually gave us a chance, without necessarily meaning to at the beginning, to look at some of this. And that started some good thinking in our institution about how we might implement a bit of a redescriptive tradition, which is something we're quite excited about. And I am super proud of the subjects. We were really kind of going into uncharted territory here. We surveyed a few other people, and to my knowledge, no one has ever done this the way we did. And they were like, natural language? Are you crazy? That's ontological heresy. You can't do that. And I was like, yeah, whatever. No. I know what my researchers' needs are. I know what people come to us for. And this has been the feature that has gotten the most positive feedback. Having a nice, flat taxonomy of natural language subject headings has been a huge asset, and we've noticed a perceptible uptick in use of our collections as a result, which we're really pumped about. So all in all, with these kind of weird MacGyver-ish hacks, we were able to build something that works pretty well. And I do want to make sure that I give mad credit to Debbie, our designer, who not only did some really nice branding for us around our institution, but we also were able to run it through Wave, some accessibility tools. The default out-of-the-box AtoM skin is not necessarily what you would call super beautiful. It works, but you know, it's not beautiful, and a lot of institutions have the default skin on it. We wanted to do a little bit more with it because we had the capacity in-house, and we're very, very happy with the way that turned out. And if anybody wants our theme, I know Debbie would be happy to share it. I've spoken to her about it, so see me after or shoot me an email if you're interested in doing some theming on an AtoM install. A lot of people haven't, and I think more people could. And so we're kind of at a happy ending, but it's happy in the etymological sense of the word, that like nothing that could have gone disastrously wrong went wrong, and the thing that did go disastrously wrong went wrong in sufficient time that by putting in a number of 12 to 16 hour days, I was able to clean it up before launch. So we didn't have any disasters. We are going to have a major anguish around deprecating rich text out of our descriptions, but that's a problem for another day. And 3.0 is not going to be out for a while, so we don't have to worry about it yet. And that's all I got. Questions, comments, rotten fruit?
Yes? Okay, now questions.
Thank God, it's the authoritative record. I don't even need to answer anything. This is great.
We do have lots of time.
So in regards to redescription in the future, do you have a plan of when you're going to revisit this? Is that sort of, do you have, besides the 3.0 upgrades, have you forward looked into this project?
A little bit. So redescription would be something that's beyond the mere bounds of the software. That would be like an institutional change to the way that we do descriptive practice. Right now, our staffing levels are a little bit up in the air. We're bringing in a new position right now. And so seeing how things are going to shake out with the available resources to allocate to this, it's not in a state now where I can clearly say, in 5 years, we'll have this amount of time to throw at this. However, in my own kind of mind, I'm vaguely thinking about something like a 15 to 20 year time frame, which is, I think, a good compromise. You wouldn't be able to do things every 5, 6 years. That's, it's too much work. It can't be done, particularly with the emphasis that we put on processing new collections. But I think that something in kind of an intermediate time range would be really good to look at. And I've noticed that we have more buzz around this on Twitter than we used to. A number of archivists are kind of talking around the water cooler about how redescription is something that we need to emphasize more in our practice, because the tendency to treat a description as a fire and forget static object is very real. It's very widely manifest, and it has severe consequences, not only for our ability to be on the right side of history, but for our users to be able to use our stuff. Case in point, right? One of the projects that we do in my department every year that's really awesome is that we bring second-year sociology students in to basically work on compiling a mortality table from old Anglican church registers from the 19th century. So they're trying to track trends in mortality for a given period in a given place. So they're going through the burial registers, and people struggle with handwriting, but people also struggle with the way that we referred to disease and mortality in the 19th century. St. Vitus dance. People die of decline. They die of visitation of God. These are things that don't mean a lot to people these days. And so we have to do a bit of disambiguation around that. So I think redescription is a way of kind of mitigating that on the archival side for researchers. So I think we're going to see more of it, but I don't have a rock-solid resourced plan ready to go.
Okay, so I've got a follow-up to that and then another question, if that's all right. When it comes to the redescription, might it be possible to sort of work up a little feedback mechanism and then just monitor, so that instead of doing we're going to look at the whole descriptive corpus and deal with everything. It's sort of as it happens. There's a bot that's going through and doing dynamic keyword searching, and when it turns out that somebody noticed something that you've got 150 of, as opposed to the rest of there's 3, then it just sort of triggers, and you go and you deal with that sort of as it filters in. So I was just sort of wondering whether that might be a possible strategy. The other thing that I wanted to, if you could just sort of expand on what the barriers were with your users when it came to the subject access that prompted the change, and just a little bit more detail, just, you know, cataloger, interested.
Totally. Okay. So to speak to your first point, I don't know that that's capacity that we would be able to build in-house, but I do think that there's room for collaborative efforts around building automated tools to take some of the labor out of redescription. The other piece, and something that some archives have talked about, is kind of crowdsourcing description and having your users have some potential for feedback. I have some very complex feelings about the labor relations aspects of crowdsourcing, to the point where I don't know that I can comfortably give you an answer if that would be something that I would be super comfortable with in my shop. We are usually pretty good about not exploiting free labor, so I would need to think about that more. I don't have a canned answer for you on that one. To speak to your second point, really the only tool that you had for searching our headings before, like our inbuilt search was horrible. It was atrocious. Like if you searched for anything, no matter how granular it was, it would either give you one result or it would return all 893. It was awful. So for years, the solution that we had was to have people Google site search our own like top level domain for the descriptions for their own keywords, which is really, really bad. So people just couldn't find stuff. There was no way for them to find subjects, and because, again, these are records that have been generated over a long period of time, what comes to your mind natural language-wise? Like, you want to look for World War I, it's not going to know to look for Great War, it's not going to know to look for any of the cognates of that term that would have been used by people doing description. So it was very difficult for users to intuitively create linkages between our holdings. And for most archival institutions that focus on collecting in a number of areas, in a special collections context, anyway, government archives are a little bit different, users are coming to you because they know you collect in a specific area. So being able to, so we did two things. We did subject headings, and we also did related content notes, where it says, see also so-and-so a fond, so-and-so an archive has related content. This guy was so-and-so's son. This guy was, you know, so-and-so's father. You might want to check out their material as well. So making those linkages a little bit more explicit was something that we had heard from users was important, and that we knew in-house was really important to do. Does that speak to your point, or did you? Yeah. Okay.
Other questions?
About the language aspect, and I'm from the Hamilton area, and I can appreciate special care made when cataloging and storing historical objects related to Indigenous people. So I wonder if you could speak to that point a little bit, and how you approached that, and how you made sure you were on the right track, and made sure that it was relevant to them as well.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a growing collecting area for us, but a lot of the early materials that we have that we had traditionally considered to be around Indigenous peoples of Canada were in fact the records of anthropologists rather than Indigenous people, right? People who were affiliated with the university, who were doing field work. And so with material like that, you're in kind of a tricky situation. We also have a collection of material related to gray owl. How many people in the room are familiar with gray owl? Okay, quite a few people. For those of you who are not, gray owl was basically someone who fraudulently posed as an Indigenous person and had a very, very lucrative speaking career, and was someone who essentially believed his own lie by the end of his life. Like, he had convinced himself that he was Indigenous. We have some material related to him. And so while I want to be able to give you a canned answer, really it's a matter of going through every single one, doing background research on the individual who is involved, sometimes beyond what you have in the archival description. Like, our gray owl collection is quite small, and our biographical sketch of him would not give you a full picture of his life and everything he was doing. So it's a matter of just reading up on every person that you possibly can. The anthropologists were a little easier in that way, but we also have the archive of Pauline Johnson, who was a very significant First Nations performer from the late 19th and early 20th century. And with a lot of these, there aren't really hard and fast answers to have. With Pauline Johnson, there are mixed feelings about her legacy on a number of levels, both from settler colonial scholars and from indigenous scholars and from members of the communities from which she came while she was alive. So with stuff like that, what you want to do is try and represent complexity as much as you possibly can. What I want to try and avoid is like a reductio ad absurdum, where we're, and in a way this is parallel to what I was talking about with the manuscripts as well. I don't want to misrepresent. So if there's complexity, I want to bring that in if possible. And that means I try and keep as abreast as I can of the conversation on Twitter. There are a number of really excellent indigenous scholars who are writing quite a bit about how to approach these things as a colonial person. So I try and take a lead from scholars like Zoe S. Todd, who write quite a bit about this sort of thing. But I don't have the answer. I can't get it 100% right. I just want to be doing the best job that I can. Does that speak to your point?
Yes, thank you. All right, we're coming up to lunch. So Jeff, did you want to make an announcement?
Just a reminder to be back here at 1 if you want to win the door prize.
Yeah, come back at 1 if you want to win the door prize. If you're not here, you don't get it.
All right, thanks, folks.
Thanks, everybody.